Welcome to Check This Out, podcast for kids,
where we explore interesting people, places, and ponderings that shape the world around us. My name is Amy Contreras.
And I'm Cece.
Check This Out is all about exploring. Right now, our series is focused on learning about famous Americans. In our first 2 episodes, we talked about Helen Keller and Benjamin Franklin. At Check This Out, we will discuss everything from the history of sports to amazing animals and inventions that changed the world. In our first 10 episodes of Check This Out, we will introduce you to some historical and modern Americans who made a major impact on the world around them. Episode 3 is one I'm so excited about because we're going to introduce you to a high-flying famous American named Amelia Earhart.
Listeners, keep your ears open.
Because at the end, I'm going to highlight 3 interesting facts about Amelia Earhart that you can continue to research on your own and check out more about after the podcast is done. Amelia Earhart broke multiple records in aviation. For example, she was the first woman to pilot a non-stop transatlantic flight solo.
Whoa!
Amelia Earhart was the first person ever, man or woman, to fly solo from Hawaii to the U.S. mainland.
No way!
And she got lost at sea on a flight attempting to be the first person to travel around the world by plane at the equator. It can be hard to imagine in today's world what an incredible pioneer Amelia Earhart was. We're used to planes that travel around the world, long flights, and female pilots, even though we still need more female pilots. But at the beginning of aviation as an industry and science, the feats we take for granted today were risky and record-setting. Keep in mind, the first ever airplane flight didn't happen until the Wright brothers achieved success in 1903.
That was a long time ago.
Amelia Earhart was a pioneer of aviation, a dynamic woman who was an author of several books, a clothing designer, professor, political advocate, and a brave pilot who pushed the boundary of what the world thought was possible. Let's learn more about this impressive woman and her achievements that make her a famous American we still talk about almost 100 years after she died. Amelia Earhart was born in Kansas in 1897. 6 years before the Wright brothers completed their first successful airplane flight in 1903. As a child, Amelia was adventurous and a bit of a tomboy. Her family moved around and she lived in several places growing up, including Kansas, Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois. She graduated high school in Chicago in 1915. Amelia was highly educated for a woman in the early 1900s. After high school, she attended college in Philadelphia. She was actively involved at college, playing hockey, serving as vice president of her class, secretary to a local Red Cross chapter, and more. But Amelia left college in 1918 before graduating. Do you have any idea why she left school? Was it A, to start flying airplanes, B, to help nurse soldiers from World War I, or C, to help take care of her parents?
If you think the answer is B, you're correct. Check this out.
Have you heard about World War I? World War I took place from 1914 to 1918, with over 30 countries involved in the war. It's also referred to as the Great War. Lots of soldiers needed care during and after the war. Amelia was inspired to help, so she went to Toronto to volunteer for the war effort and help soldiers as a nurse. Her time in Toronto as a nurse was critical because it was during her time in Toronto that Amelia Earhart had one of the most defining moments of her life. She attended her first flying exposition with a friend while in Toronto in 1918. Do you know what a flying exposition is? Well, back in the early days of flight, these were much more common. If you've ever heard of the Blue Angels or an air and water show, that is a type of flying exposition that still happens today.
That is cool.
A flying exposition is where aircraft are displayed and flown publicly. Pilots and companies get to showcase different types of airplanes via demonstration. The demonstrations include information booths that explain the technology, but also displays of what the airplanes can do up in the air by showing flying and tricks.
I learned something new today.
What is so special about this exposition that Amelia attended? Well, while she was watching the pilots fly, she was seated with her friend on a hill so they could get a better view. As they were watching, a stunt pilot dove his plane at Amelia and her friend from where they were seated on the hill. can you imagine an airplane coming right at you? That must have been really scary. But instead of scampering away as the plane dove at them, Amelia held her ground and became intrigued by all things flying and aviation. After her time volunteering as a nurse in Toronto, she enrolled in pre-medical classes at Columbia University. Like I mentioned, she was highly educated for a woman in the early 1900s. But again, she did not graduate because in 1920, Amelia moved to Los Angeles to be with her parents. It was in Los Angeles where she took her first flight inside an airplane. She experienced this life-changing first flight with a veteran pilot named Frank Hawks. Have you ever ridden on an airplane before? What do you like most about airplanes? Well, after Amelia went on her first flight, she loved it so much she wanted to take flying lessons. She had her first flying lesson in January of 1921 with a flight instructor named Netta Snook. Amelia loved flying so much, she took a number of jobs to save money for more flight lessons and to buy her own airplane. In 1921, Amelia was able to purchase her first airplane, and she gave it a name. Her first airplane was a yellow Kinner Airster biplane. What do you think Amelia Earhart named her first airplane? Was it A, Canary, B, Lightning, or C, Sunshine?
Mama, can I guess? A.
If you said Canary, you're right. What a fun name. Perfect for a little yellow airplane. Amelia took her first solo flight in 1921 and started setting records almost immediately. Let's talk about some of the aviation records that Amelia Earhart set. Before she even officially earned her pilot's license, which happened in 1923, she set the unofficial feminine altitude record of 14,000 feet in 1922. That means she flew the highest a female pilot had ever flown before. Even though she had already started breaking records in 1922, in 1923, Amelia Earhart became the 16th woman to receive an official pilot's license, and many more records after the altitude record were to follow. We told you about some of these records at the beginning of the podcast. Do you remember any? Well, if you mentioned transatlantic travel or Hawaii, you're right on target. So let's recap. A few of Amelia Earhart's major records included that in 1928, she was the first woman ever to be a transatlantic passenger. This means she flew as a passenger across the Atlantic Ocean from Canada to Ireland. This was a much longer distance than planes in the late 1920s were used to flying, so it was a big deal and risky. Others had died attempting the same flight before Amelia and her counterpart succeeded. She later wrote a book on this experience. In May of 1932, Amelia Earhart became the first woman and the second person ever after Charles Lindbergh to fly nonstop and solo across the Atlantic Ocean. She was also the first person to cross the Atlantic by air twice, since she had done it in 1928 as well when she flew it as a passenger. As a reminder, traveling across the Atlantic Ocean by plane is known as transatlantic flight. In 1932, she completed the first solo nonstop flight by a woman across the United States from Los Angeles, California to Newark, New Jersey. Again, this was a major accomplishment due to the distance between LA and Newark, 2,477 miles to be exact. All of these records Amelia set or broke were a huge deal at the time. Many of these feats of aviation had never been done before, but seeing a woman do it was highly unusual. And she didn't stop there. In 1929, she set the feminine speed record. In 1930, she broke the feminine speed record again. In 1931, she became the first woman to fly an autogyro. In 1931, she also set the autogyro altitude record of 5,612 meters, which is over 18,000 feet. In 1935, she completed the first ever solo Hawaii to mainland U.S. flight. 1935 was a busy year for her. During that year, she also set the speed record between Mexico City and Washington, D.C., and became the first person to fly solo from Mexico City to Newark, New Jersey. Wow, that was a lot of records.
What was your favorite fact?
I mentioned at the start of the podcast, Amelia Earhart wasn't just an aviation pioneer. While she was busy making her name breaking records and flying all over the world, she also had additional contributions beyond just aviation. She designed a series of clothes for women as well as luggage. The Earhart luggage was actually sold all the way up until the 1990s. Amelia published multiple books in her short life. Her first book was about her experience on the record-setting transatlantic flight she was the passenger on in 1928. She launched that book with the help of a publisher named George Putman. Her book helped her gain fame across the world and led to her becoming the aviation editor for Cosmopolitan magazine. Amelia and George had a long partnership, and they were so close that they eventually got married. I also mentioned Amelia was a big advocate for women in the aviation field. Did you know she helped found the first organization for female aviators? See if you can guess what this organization was called. Was it A, the Flying Femmes, B, the Aviationistas, or C, the 99s?
I think it's C.
If you said C, the 99s, you're right. Amelia not only helped found and launch the 99s, she served as its first president in 1931. In 1935, Amelia Earhart became a visiting professor at Purdue University. She was invited to teach at Purdue by the president of the university. She was a staunch advocate of higher education for women, especially in engineering and science. In addition to teaching, she was a counselor and a guest lecturer.
She had a lot of jobs.
Purdue's president, Edward Elliott, was an active supporter of her career. He helped convince Purdue to purchase a twin-engine Lockheed 10E Electroplane for her. And if you know anything about Amelia Earhart, you probably have already heard about her final flight, which was her most famous, where she mysteriously disappeared over the Pacific Ocean. Using the plane that Purdue University purchased for her, Amelia Earhart started preparations to make a flight around the world in 1937. Amelia first tried to fly around the world in March of 1937, but she had a crash in Honolulu, Hawaii, a few days after getting started. She made a second attempt to fly around the world in May. On May 21st of 1937, she took off from Oakland, California, starting the first leg of her last flight. Amelia Earhart wasn't alone for her final flight. She had her navigator, Fred Noonan, with her. Amelia had a fierce desire to be the first person, man or woman, to fly around the world at the equator. She even asked the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, and the Navy for their help in accomplishing this goal.
Check this out.
Flying around the world at the equator is where the globe is the thickest. The equator is an imaginary line that's drawn around the middle of the Earth to divide it into the northern and southern hemispheres. As Amelia and Fred started working their way around the world, they traveled to Brazil, Dakar, Bangkok, and Australia. They completed almost 22,000 miles of the trip around the world. On June 29, 1937, Amelia's plane landed in New Guinea. She took off from New Guinea on July 2nd with the goal of flying to Howland Island to refuel. Howland Island was a tiny island in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean. Unfortunately, Amelia and Fred were unable to find the island and ended up losing radio contact with the Coast Guard. They officially disappeared over the Pacific, and a massive search took place until October of 1937. Even President Roosevelt helped fund the search through July. In 1939, Amelia Earhart was officially declared dead by a court. Amelia Earhart was an aviation icon. She was only 39 years old when her plane went missing over the Pacific Ocean. Her legacy opened doors for women in aviation around the world and showed millions the possibility of what can happen when you push boundaries. Now let's take a minute for you to take 3 facts away from this episode to check out on your own.
Here are 3 of our favorite facts.
The first, Amelia Earhart took flying lessons with a female instructor named Netta Snook. When you check this out, learn more about Netta and her story. Second one, Amelia Earhart wrote 3 books. Check out these books and learn about which stories they tell of her life. The third fact, Amelia wasn't just a pilot. She was a fashion designer and a professor. Check out her time at Purdue University and her impact on her students. By now, if you've been listening to our podcast, you know we don't just love investigating cool people, places, and ponderings. We also love to rhyme. So here's a poem we created about Amelia Earhart to help you remember her amazing accomplishments and why we celebrate her as a famous American. In skies so bright, Amelia soared, a pusher of boundaries whose dreams loudly roared. From Kansas plains, she took her flight. Into the sky, she flew strong at daring heights. In her plain canary, she flew so high, breaking so many records, my oh my. Transatlantic trips, both near and far, a pilot's name, a shining star. She blazed a trail for all to see, inspiring future flyers like you and me. Her final flight across the Pacific was rough. Although she was lost at sea, we know her spirit was tough. Amelia Earhart's legacy lives on. We remember her long after she's gone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Check This Out podcast as we explore famous Americans. Here at Check This Out, we know it can be hard to tell if information you find online is accurate. This podcast is a tool for you to help you do something called citing your sources. On Check This Out, we use verified sources to build the stories you hear about. Our sources for this week's episode are Encyclopedia Britannica, the Smithsonian Institute, the U.S. Naval Institute, PBS, and Purdue University.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening.